The 1970s were a different world, a time when everything seemed a little slower, rougher, freer, and perhaps a little bit mad. Britain was changing. Factories still hummed, coal fires still burned, and kids played outside until the sun went down. It was the decade of brown wallpaper, Ford Cortinas, and endless cups of tea. But most of all, it was a time when ordinary life looked very different from what we know today. So different, in fact, that if someone from 2025 found themselves in 1970s Britain, they'd be shocked, speechless, maybe even a little terrified. Here are 10 things you could do in 1970s Britain that would absolutely shock people today. 1. Kids played outside until dark, alone, wild, and free. Go out and play. That was all your mum said. No schedule, no text, no checking in. You'd leave the house after breakfast with a football under your arm, maybe a jam sandwich in a paper bag, and you wouldn't be seen again until dusk. Your playground was the entire neighborhood. You'd build dens, climb trees, and race bikes down gravel hills without helmets. If you fell, you brushed yourself off. If you ripped your jeans, your mum stitched them up. And if you didn't come home until the streetlights came on, that's when you knew playtime was over. Today, letting your kid disappear for 10 minutes would cause a panic and possibly a police search. But in the 70s, that freedom was childhood. 2. Smoking was everywhere. Literally everywhere you could smoke, almost anywhere. On the bus, in the office, in restaurants, hospitals, cinemas, even airplanes. Teachers smoked in the staff room, doctors smoked between patients, and your uncle smoked while driving you to school with the windows shut. It was normal. Ashtrays sat proudly on every coffee table. A fresh pack of Woodbines on the mantelpiece was a household staple. You'd walk into a pub and the smoke was so thick you could barely see the dartboard. It's almost unimaginable today. You'd be fined, banned, or shamed online. But back then, nobody cared. It was just part of life's aroma. Beer, chip fat, and cigarette smoke. 3. Seatbelts were optional, and so were rules. Cars were built like tanks, but safety was an afterthought. Seatbelts? Optional. Car seats? Rare. Children sprawled across the back seat or stood between the front seats, leaning on the dashboard. If the car was full, someone would ride in the boot, and that was normal. No one worried about airbags or speed limits. You just piled in, rolled the windows down, and hit the road with "Stayin' Alive" blaring on the radio, ironically. Today, the idea sounds insane. But in the 1970s, the car was a moving living room, complete with crisps, smoke, and freedom. 4. Teenagers in pubs, and nobody blinked. In the 1970s, the local pub was the heart of every community. And if you looked old enough to hold a pint, you could probably get one. 15, 16, didn't matter much. The landlord knew your dad, your uncle, your teacher. You'd sit in the corner, playing darts, pretending to sip your lager shandy, listening to grown-up gossip and bad singing. Nobody panicked, nobody called the police, and nobody took photos. The pub was a place of belonging, not rebellion. Nowadays, a teenager in a pub would mean ID checks, warnings, and viral outrage. But back then, the pub was simply where life happened. 5. Strangers looked after you, and parents trusted them. If you got lost, someone helped you. If you scraped your knee, a stranger cleaned it up. If you were hungry, someone's mum would feed you and send you home. Hitchhiking was common. People gave lifts to strangers without thinking twice. Kids walked to school alone, crossed roads without crossing guards, and played in alleys behind houses, all under the watchful eyes of neighbors. Today, we see headlines and warnings. Back then, people assumed the best, not the worst. It wasn't perfect, but there was an unspoken rule. The whole street raised the children. 6. You could say almost anything on TV. If you turn on a 1970s television set today, you might blush. Jokes, language, stereotypes, it was the Wild West of entertainment. Comedians said things that would end careers now. Sitcoms poked fun at everyone, and somehow everyone laughed. Shows like Love Thy Neighbor, The Benny Hill Show, and On the Buses were prime-time hits. It wasn't about being cruel, it was about laughing at life, unfiltered and raw. Today, half of that content would be banned, flagged, or debated on Twitter within minutes. But in the 70s, television reflected the messy, imperfect world people lived in, without apology. 7. You could buy fireworks. As a kid, bonfire night was absolute mayhem and glorious. You didn't need a license or an adult or even a plan. You'd walk into the corner shop with a few coins and walk out with a box of fireworks. Bangers, rockets, sparklers, all yours. You'd spend the night setting them off in back gardens, or sometimes indoors by mistake. The sky would light up, the air would smell of smoke and excitement, and yes, accidents happened. But for kids, it was freedom on fire. Today, fireworks are heavily regulated and sold with 10 safety warnings. Back then, they were a rite of passage. 8. Kids bought things that would be illegal now. The local shopkeeper sold you everything, no questions asked. Cigarettes, sold singly, by the stick. Penknives, hanging next to the sweets. Caps for toy guns, right beside the toffees. If you needed glue, petrol for your go-kart, or even air pellets, the shopkeeper would smile and hand them over. No ID, no warning labels, no panic. Parents trusted kids to use common sense. And most of the time, they did. Today, it's unimaginable. But that mix of risk and trust made growing up feel like an adventure. 9. Talking to strangers was normal. And nice. In the 1970s, Britain was social in a way that's hard to imagine now. You talked to strangers at bus stops. You chatted with people in the queue. Neighbors leaned over fences just to talk about the weather for an hour. There were no phones in your pocket, just people. And if someone said something you didn't agree with, you didn't block them. You debated, then had tea. Now, we hide behind screens. But back then, conversation was community. It wasn't about being right. It was about being connected. 10. Sundays were silent and beautifully boring. If you grew up in 1970s, Britain, you remember the sound of Sundays, or rather, the lack of it. Shops were closed, streets were quiet, the smell of roast beef drifted through the neighborhood. The radio played softly. The family sat down together. You couldn't go shopping, you couldn't scroll, you couldn't order anything. You just rested. Today, the idea of everything shutting down for a day feels impossible. But back then, Sundays were sacred, slow, warm, peaceful. The world stopped so families could start the week together. 11. You could be bored, and that was okay. In the 1970s, boredom wasn't a problem. It was part of life. There were 3 TV channels, often showing nothing but test cards and static. You had to invent your own entertainment. You'd read, draw, build something, or simply sit by the window and think. It was quiet, and that quiet built imagination. Today, we fill every second with screens. But in the 70s, those silent moments were where dreams began. 12. Life was simpler and somehow happier. Without smartphones, internet, or constant noise, life unfolded slower and maybe more meaningfully. When you visited friends, you knocked on the door unannounced. When you phoned someone, you hoped they were home. When you met, you talked properly. People remember faces, voices, laughter, not usernames. And when you said goodbye, that was it. You couldn't message later, you just waited until next time. It sounds inconvenient, but it made life real. So, what do we learn from these 1970s shocks? That life wasn't safer, cleaner, or easier. It was raw, alive, and human. People trusted strangers. Children grew up independent. Families talked. There were risks, yes, but also connection. Modern Britain is smarter, healthier, more efficient, but we've lost something too. The chaos, the charm, the small joys of not being watched, measured, or connected every second. 1970s. Britain wasn't perfect, but it was perfectly real. Maybe that's why, when we look back at those hazy photographs of kids on bikes, dads with sideburns, and mums with rollers, we don't just see the past, we see freedom. we see community. We see a time when the world was smaller, but hearts were bigger.